Hey Lance, I wanted to answer your question about who is my picture sideways? No, it isn't. I guess it's just a camera. It just makes it look sideways. Sorry, but yeah, I want to answer your question about who originally sold slaves to white men. Um, and I think it was a very funny question for you to ask too, because you're kind of insinuating that slavery was meant to be because Africans sold slaves to the Americas. But what you have completely wrong is chances are they weren't sold. So that tells me right there that you don't know history that well. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be condescending, but obviously you didn't read the same history books that I read because you probably just heard like a superficial story of, well, Africans were poor and they had to sell slaves. But what really had happened was the Westerners were very smart and they were tacticians of the slave trade, the slave campaign, or however you want to name it. So what really happened, Lance, and for anybody else that needs to know too, is that what would happen is the Westerners would come into Africa and they would know that there was like a few tribes squabbling in the area. So what they would do is they would go to one tribe and they say, hey, you guys have gums and spices, and we need those gums and spices. So we'll trade you your gums and spices for guns and gunpowder. And these other tribes are like, sweet, let's do it. This other tribe, and they'd be like, all right, cool. Let's call them Tribe A. But then Tribe B now, they see that this other tribe that they have beef with, they see that they're armed, and they're like, well, crap, well, shit, we're going to go, and we're going to go trade some gums and spices to Europeans too, to the Westerners. So they would go to the Westerners, and the Westerners would say, well, we don't need gums and spices anymore. We need slaves. And, so the, Tribe B would say, well, we don't want to sell our friends and family. Because, Lance, you got to think about this. These are small tribes. This is not like a city of like 1 million people where, whoever was governing that city didn't know anybody really besides his immediate family. No, he knew everybody, or they knew everybody that they were about to sell. So they said, well, we don't want to sell you slaves. But the Europeans would retort and say, well, you have two choices. A, you can sell us slaves and we'll give you guns. And you're going to be able to defend yourselves from your neighboring tribes. Or B, you don't sell us any slaves and we don't arm you. And the other tribe is going to wipe out your entire tribe. So it's like you can either sell some of your people and defend the rest of your people, or you won't sell anybody and you can let everybody die. So that's how slavery was, but back then. And then let's touch base on another topic of slavery, since you want to talk about slavery and you want to talk about the Americas, because chances are, Lance, you're definitely not from America. Like wherever your family was, it was not from America unless you're like Native American. But there were governors and other historic writers who talked about slavery throughout the world, and that the United States was the worst place to be a slave. Kind of like Grand Rapids is like the worst place to be a minority, but we won't go there. But yes, so United States was the worst place to be a slave because not only were you stripped of your clothing and dragged across the street, the sea, not the street, but the street eventually too, but the sea. And you're stripped of your clothing, separated from your family, repercussions that we see still today happening. Families, and African-American families just not sticking together because of, what happened back then. And, it's just a product of what we did as a people back then. So you got to look at it like, why it was the worst place to be an American slave. Well, you were raped. Your families were raped. Your mother, your sister, your wife, your kids were raped. They were murdered. They were beaten. They were dragged on horses. People still dragging people behind cars in the 50s, 60s, 70s, still hanging people just for hanging out with a white chick or a white person. You can get hung or beaten and buried in the lake, or just left to burn or hang from a tree. like not that long ago. But back then, the men were overworked until they, literally exhausted and died. So yeah, and we can go on. Like the other things that happened, I don't want to say because it's pretty graphic and it's disgusting. But then let's look at like a place like the Middle East, which is kind of in shambles right now. They have their struggles, just like we have our struggles. But if you were a slave in the Middle East, you could actually rise up as a slave and become the caliphate, which is equivalent to our president of the United States, but only you'd be the president of the entire Middle East, which is pretty powerful. And it wasn't something rare. It was actually something that like occasionally happened. Like it was like a reoccurring event where a slave would rise up to become the president of this entire world. Imagine that. And how long did it take us to have a black president? And how long will it take us to even have a female president? So before you talk about where, who originally sold slaves to the white man, it wasn't as straightforward as you're trying to put it. I mean, that would be like me saying, we don't even go there. I don't want to be condescending, but it's pretty sad that you'd actually try to say that slavery was okay because they were sold to the white man, as you put it, by other blacks from Africa, because it really wasn't like that at all whatsoever. I'm sorry, bud.